Hello everybody, welcome to another 4X Adventures video. This is hopefully the first of many videos in a series called Campfire Stories. Now the idea behind Campfire Stories is to document some of the amazing adventures that we all four-wheel drivers have had. And every single four-wheel driver and adventurer that I've spoken to has told me simply amazing stories, and they deserve to be filmed and documented. So this will be hopefully the first of many such stories. So today I'm going to take you back about 20 years and tell you about my very first four-wheel driving experience. A long, long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I was a young whippersnapper. I was 20 years old and I was working for a construction and mining company. And it was my job to fly all around the country into extremely remote parts of the desert to set up IT equipment for mining sites. And this was a fantastic job. I absolutely loved it. So the very first of my trips to remote locations involved flying for several days to get to the mining site. So on the first day, I flew from Sydney to Perth, and that took up the entire day. Got to Perth. By the time I got to the hotel, it was midnight, and I had to be up at 3 a.m. to leave the hotel at 4 in order to get to the airport and catch a 5 o'clock flight. So I didn't get any sleep at all, really. So next morning I made it to the airport and I caught a regional flight. Now a regional flight is typically a much smaller aircraft. This one had about 20 people in it, and we flew from Perth to Kalgoorlie. Now Kalgoorlie is in the bottom of Western Australia. For those not familiar with Western Australia, it's several hundred kilometres northeast of Perth. It's a big mining town. So flew to Kalgoorlie and then I caught another flight, this time an even smaller aeroplane. This was a small twin-engine Cessna that only seated, I think, 6 people. And that's including the pilots. Then we flew off out into the remote desert and landed in who knows where. It was just a sandy dirt strip. There really was no infrastructure out there, no roads, nothing at all. Just somebody had just cleared off a bit of dirt, and that was the runway. We landed. I got piled into a four-wheel drive and taken off to the mining site. Now, if anyone's not familiar with life on a mining site, there's nothing to do out there. There's no shops, no television, no radio, nothing to spend your money on or nothing to occupy you apart from work. So there's a little mining camp that's typically just outside the actual mining site, and that's where we live in demountable buildings. And then every day you get piled into four-wheel drives and get driven out to the actual mining site. And that's how it was for me. And when you're driven out there, you're out there for the entire day. That's 12 hours every day. So you had to take your breakfast and lunch with you and anything else that you might need throughout the day. So you took it all with you to the mining site, and then you did your 12-hour shift. In my case, it was setting up IT equipment. And at the end of the day, you get driven back and you have dinner in the mess hall, and then you go to sleep because there's nothing else to do. And then next day, you repeat it again. So these sites were so remote that there was only one single flight in every single week. You had to wait a week before you could leave. It's like Hotel California. If you missed your flight, you were there for another week. Or if there was a cyclone and they couldn't fly, you were there for another week. So it really was very, very remote. So I had a huge amount of work to get done, and enough to keep me busy for a full 7 days. But I made the decision early on in my career to always get as much work as I can done so that I can hopefully have 1 day free at the end of it. So I try and do 7 days of work in 6 days so that I get 1 day to look around in. So that was always my philosophy, and that always actually worked out for me. So I worked my butt off for 6 days, and on the 7th day I got the chance to look around. So this was my first chance to have a look around the Pilbara area of Western Australia. And then the Pilbara area is sort of the top half of Western Australia. Mountainous, very rocky, very beautiful. So I asked to borrow a 4-wheel drive, and the guy says, "Righto, son, you know how to drive one of these things?" And I said, "Sure I do." It's a car. How different can it be? I didn't say that part out loud, but I said, "Sure." He goes, "No worries, here's the keys. There's a jerry can of water in the back, and bring it back in one piece." So there I was, 20 years old, out in the middle of the desert with a 4-wheel drive, at large in the world, or as at large as you can get in the middle of nowhere. So really wanted to go have a look at a place called Karijini National Park. I've heard that is absolutely beautiful, and I really wanted to go have a look at this place. But I've also been living off mining food or camp food for the past 6 days, and I can't say I was starving, but I wanted real food. I needed Coke and chocolate. So rather than heading directly towards Karijini National Park, when I got to the main road, I turned left and I headed down to the nearest town. Now, the nearest town was Newman. This was about 80 kilometres south. So I started driving towards Newman in my 4-wheel drive, happy as anything. And then I saw a dirt track leaving the main road, heading up this really, really steep hill. And at this point, I had never been off-road before. And I thought, hey, I'm in a 4-wheel drive, I'm indestructible. Let's give this a shot. So I left the road and I started driving on this corrugated dirt track that's going up this very, very steep hill. And I didn't know anything at all about 4-wheel drives back then, as I said. So I just left the car as it was and I just started driving up this hill. And it was rutted and everything, but it was bouncing up this hill. And after a while, I finally made it to the very top of this hill. And I was feeling really proud of myself. At my first off-road adventure. But when I got to the top, there was no place to turn around. The track did continue on for a bit down the other side, but it was really steep and I wasn't game to try it. It just looked like it was something that I couldn't handle. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to do a 50-point turn and try and turn around and come back from where I had come. So I eventually did that, and I drove back down the hill, rejoined the highway, and kept on heading down towards Newman. And I was feeling really happy. Like, this was my first off-road experience. Just a dirt track, but hey, back then I was really, really happy with just a dirt track. So then a little bit later on, I saw another dirt track, this time leaving the road towards the left. And this track headed directly off, and it didn't look like it belonged to a farm or a private property or anything. It was just a dirt track that looked inviting. And every time you see a dirt track, oh, a branch just fell. Every time you see a dirt track that looks inviting, that's the precursor to trouble. Trouble will follow you. But along with trouble comes adventures. So anyway, I decided to go and see what was down this dirt track. I started driving along this track, and it was getting narrower and narrower. And after a while, it was rather hilly, this region, and there was some cliffs along the left-hand side. Not very tall ones, but it was a sheer wall of rock along the left-hand side of the track. And then on the right-hand side, a sheer drop with this small one-way track heading off, just essentially like that. I was driving on this track, and there was the cliff wall, the track, and then the drop. And I was driving along this one-way track, and I didn't think anything of it. The track was sort of winding around, and eventually it came to a stop. A huge big tree had fallen over and blocked the track. And the tree was so big, there's no way that I could move it. Some of its roots were still on the ground. It was a huge big tree. So I couldn't move it, and I couldn't go around it because there was a cliff face on one side and a big drop on the other. So the only thing I could do at this stage is head backwards. Now, I couldn't turn around because the track wasn't wide enough to do a 3-point turn or even a 50-point turn. So I had to put it in reverse and start reversing down this extremely narrow winding track, winding backwards. I had only been driving a car for 3 years or so at this point. I wasn't filled with confidence having to reverse back along this narrow track with a sheer drop on one side. But I had no choice, so I started reversing back along this winding track until I got to a point where, as I reversed, in front of me I see that the track had become wider. So I decided to turn around. Now, I decided that I was going to drive nose forward in towards the cliff face and then reverse back so the back of the car is facing the drop and try and turn around that way. It just seemed the easiest thing to do at the time. So I started doing this 50-point turn, and at one point one of the back wheels was actually off the edge in the air. And I knew I was close. I didn't realise I was quite that close to the edge. And the wheel was actually in the air. Before I go any further, when I left the main road to go onto the track, there was some buttons and dials in the car, and I had managed to put the car into not only four-wheel drive mode, but I had managed to turn the diff locks on. And back then I didn't even know that diff locks existed. But I had managed to turn the diff locks on. I didn't know it then, but I realised now what I had done. So when I was doing this 50-point turn, when one of the back wheels was actually hanging over the edge, I still had traction because the other back wheel wasn't over the edge. If I wouldn't have accidentally turned the diff locks on, then when one of the back wheels would have been in the air, it would have been spinning. The four-wheel drive system would have sent all the power to the wheel without the traction, the one that's in the air, and no power to the wheel that is on the ground, and I would have been stuck. And now there was no mobile phone reception here. There was no two-way radio. I was completely alone and no one knew where I had gone. So it could have been a lot worse. But luckily, I had accidentally turned the diff lock on, and that gave me traction on both wheels. And I was actually finally managed to turn around. And I ended up making it back to the road, breathed a huge sigh of relief, took it out of four-wheel drive mode. I started driving towards Newman. And I finally made it, and I went into the first shop I could find, and I bought chocolate, I bought Coke, all the essentials. So once I had my essentials, once I was stocked up, I decided to hit the road and go see this national park. So I drove back the way I had come, the 80 k's back to where the mining site was, and kept on going north. And a few hundred kilometres later, I came upon we turn off to Karijini National Park. Turned off to the national park and it became dirt track. And I started driving along this dirt road, and I remember it was a really hot day. It would have been at easily 45 degrees Celsius. I was wearing still the mining attire, so I was wearing jeans, steel cap boots, a long sleeve cotton shirt, stuff that you wouldn't wear in a 45 degree day, but inside the car with the aircon on, that's how I came from the mining site, that's what I was wearing. And the national park was, at the entrance at least, it was nothing special that I could remember. It was a bit of scrub and mostly just red dirt, not much vegetation around. Finally I came across a sign that said, I can't remember the name of the gorge, but there was a gorge off to the right. There's a car park and there was supposed to be a gorge there. So I decided I would go have a look at that. So I was driving along and I saw as I was approaching, the chain link fence all the way around the perimeter of the car park, just wooden stumps in the ground with a bit of chain linking them together, and that designated the car parking area. So I park the car and I get out and I approach the edge of the chain. It's only when I started getting close to the chain that I see this enormous gorge just open up in front of me in the ground. The ground just split in two, and this huge drop, a couple of 100 meters. And it was spectacular. Just orange-red cliff walls. The sun was casting long shadows down the gorge. There was a pool of green water down the very bottom. Not much water, but a little pool of green water down the bottom. And it was absolutely amazing. And being 20 and stupid, I decided I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to walk down there. So there was a walking track that led all the way down to the bottom of the gorge. So I get out, put a hat on, still dressed as I am, with a water bottle and a camera, and I started walking along this track to get to the very bottom. And it was about probably midday, or probably a bit after midday by this stage. And I finally, after probably an hour's walk, made it down to the very bottom of the gorge, and down the bottom is flat rocks, sort of piled haphazardly, but huge big sheets of flat rock everywhere lining the bottom. And if there's rain, then that would have been the bottom of a river, but there hadn't been much rain, and so it was just exposed flat rock. So I became aware of a really pungent, strong smell, and I didn't know what it was at first. And I was walking along these flat rocks, and then I saw a dead kangaroo. That's what the smell was. And there was another one, and a dead dingo, and all these dead, decomposing animals scattered around the place. It was so hot. They had no water, or very little water, and they had just perished. So up the top of the canyon, it would have been about 45 degrees, but down in the bottom of the canyon, with the heat reflecting off all these rocks, it was a lot hotter than that. And in fact, I had a digital thermometer with me that I used to use in the computer rooms in the offices to check the air conditioning. So I pulled that out of my backpack and I held it out at arm's length, about a metre from the ground. Just held it out like this, and I had a look at the reading on this digital thermometer. 54.2 degrees Celsius. And I'm wearing steel cap boots and jeans and a thick cotton shirt. It was stinking hot. So it was ridiculously hot. That, to this day, has been the hottest temperature that I've been in. I've been in several 48 degree days and similar, but that was the hottest. So I finally, after another hour or two, made it back to the top of the canyon, finally got into the car, and by this stage it would have been 3 o'clock roughly, And I decided, okay, it's time that I started heading back to the mining site. So I left the car park and I started driving back in the direction that I'd come from. And there was about 100 kilometres, I remember, of dirt track before I got to the main road again. And I'm driving along this winding dirt track through the national park, and suddenly the car starts shaking. And shaking and shuddering, and it conked out. The engine stopped. And straight away, I realised that I'm out of fuel. And I didn't even think to look at the fuel gauge at any point throughout the entire day. But there I was in the middle of nowhere. It was a national park, but the national park is enormous and it was deserted, not another car in sight. And I just ran out of fuel. Not a good situation to be in, especially considering how hot it was. So I'm thinking, well, what can I do? And then I realised, there's a switch. There's a secondary fuel tank. I'm saved. I switched the thing across the secondary fuel tank, trying to start the car, and eventually I got the car running again. And so I thought, thank God, I'm saved. It's all good now. So I made it back to the main road, and then I turned right and I started heading south back towards the mining site. And I'd been driving for probably 2 hours when the petrol light came, or the fuel light came. It was a diesel, so the fuel light came on. And I knew that I was still another probably 2 hours drive from the mining site. Now I was in trouble. I was in the middle of the desert on a deserted stretch of road. The only traffic would have been the occasional mining truck, but even they were few and far between. It was still over 40 degrees Celsius, no mobile phone reception, no two-way radio reception, and of course nobody knew where I was. All they knew at the mine site was I had borrowed a four-wheel drive to go looking around, but nobody knew exactly where I was going. I should have told someone. Now I was in trouble. It was a quite hilly country, gentle hills up and down. So I remember every time I got to the top of a hill, I put it into neutral and I rolled down. When I got to the bottom, I put it back in gear and gave it just enough gas to get to the top of the next hill and started rolling down again. I turned the radio off, I turned the aircon off, I turned everything off just to try and conserve power and conserve fuel. And it went like that for a couple of hours. I don't know how many kilometres I could have gotten out of that car with the fuel light on, but I did at least 150. And finally, as it was getting dark, I saw the sign to turn off the road, off left, to head to the mining site. And I turned off the road and I started driving along the dirt track to get to the gatehouse at the mining site. Finally, I could see it up ahead. It's there 50 metres away from me, 40 metres away from me. The car shuddered and then it came to a halt. I had run out of fuel in my secondary fuel tank. For the second time that day, I'd run out of fuel meters from the gatehouse. So that was such a stupid thing to do. But it's a story that I remember to this day, and I remember it in quite good detail. It was a bit of adventure. It was, in a sense, my very first outback adventure. And of course, I had learnt a lot from that. Always tell somebody where you're going. Always make sure you've got enough fuel to get there and back, and some spare. It could have been a lot worse, but I live to tell the tale. I learnt about it. I learnt from it, sorry. I'll make sure that that doesn't happen to me nowadays. Every time I visited a mining site from that point onwards, word had gotten around, even before I got there. They don't give this guy a car. But they always ended up giving me a car. And that's my very first forward driving adventure. On the next video, I'll tell you more about my adventures. They get far crazier and far more interesting than this one, but I thought I would start this series off with this little story. So thank you very much. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. And if you have any interesting stories, tell me about it in the comments. Or if you would like to be featured in one of these videos and you're in Australia or Sydney especially, but if you're in Australia and you want to be featured in one of these videos, then drop me a line, let me know, and hopefully if I'm organising a trip in your general area, we can meet up and I can film an interview. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next video. Take care. Oh, and subscribe and like and all that good stuff. See you later.